What if I told you that in a high stakes NATO dogfight, the jet most experts dismissed as a lightweight underdog actually decimated the world's most elite heavy fighters? For years, critics called the JAS 39 Gripen overrated, but the data from the Baltic range tells a chillingly different story. Now, before we dive into the cockpit, let me be crystal clear. This is a hypothetical strategic analysis, a what if scenario based on declassified exercise data. But for anyone who cares about Canadian sovereignty, this is the conversation we need to have. Imagine, if you will, the cold gray morning over the Baltic Sea, an environment so similar to our own high Arctic that you can almost feel the frost on the wings, and you see it, the JAS 39 Gripen, a jet that on paper shouldn't even be in the same sky as the heavy hitters. They said it was too light. They said it was too small. They said it was underpowered to challenge real frontline fighters. And for years, on Western briefing boards, it was labeled a defender, not a predator. A nice piece of Swedish engineering that looked good on marketing charts but had no place in a real daylight fight against heavier, faster jets. But let's look at the reality of the merge. Because while the analysts in their air conditioned offices in Ottawa or DC were busy calculating thrust to weight ratios, a lone Swedish Gripen was rolling into a fight everyone believed it couldn't match. You have to understand the disrespect this aircraft faced. Pilots dismissed it as overrated, a knife brought to a gunfight, but when that jet found itself face to face with elite adversaries, it didn't just survive, it began to rewrite the laws of air combat right in front of their eyes. We're talking about NATO evaluation centers, where the logic was simple. The Gripen carries a single engine, a light fuel load, and reduced weapons capacity compared to the monsters like the F-15, the F-16, or the Eurofighter Typhoon. But Sweden didn't build this thing to win a beauty contest or a spreadsheet war. They built it to win the airspace over home terrain. And for us in Canada, that should sound incredibly familiar, shouldn't it? During this specific exercise, the sky was clear, the visibility was clean, and you had F-16 Fighting Falcons and Eurofighter Typhoons backed by NATO AWACS, all hunting for one solo aggressor, the Gripen. Can you imagine the confidence in those other cockpits? One American pilot even remarked before engine startup that this was a knife in a gunfight, but inside the Swedish briefing room, the mood wasn't arrogant, it was surgical. The Gripen doctrine is built on one core principle that we as Canadians should take to heart: never fight the enemy's fight. If they want speed, give them geometry. If they want brute force, give them a problem they can't solve with an afterburner. As the fighters launched, the F-16 seconds did exactly what they were trained to do. They climbed fast, seeking that energy dominance, while the Typhoons took the mid-height patrol zones, but the Gripen stayed low, running silent radar, feeding off the data link, shaping the entire engagement before a single shot was even simulated. When the bandit contact was called, two Falcons peeled off to investigate, and this was the opening the Swedes wanted. The Gripen didn't run, it accelerated toward them, and as the F-16 seconds tried to push vertical to get that top-down missile lock, the Gripen refused to play along. It pulled into a sharp horizontal turn, carving a near-perfect circle in the sky, compressing the range so brutally fast that the missile envelopes collapsed before the Falcons could even find a solution. This is where it gets intense. The jets met in the merge, the fight became visual, and suddenly, the smallest jet in the sky snapped its nose around faster than anyone expected, forcing the American pilots into desperate correction maneuvers. The Swedish pilot didn't just chase them, he turned into the space between them, a blind geometry that no training manual covers, and in seconds, that compact Delta Canard slipped behind the trailing Falcon. Do you hear that? That's the sound of a solid simulated gun kill. The radio cracked, Gripen scored. Silence. Total silence on the net. The dismissal began to crack right then and there because the smallest jet had just secured the first kill and the exercise had only just begun. But the NATO leads weren't going to take that lying down, so they recalculated, they got tense, and they shifted to a two-ship bracket attack, a classic pincer maneuver designed to box the Gripen in and deny it any escape. They sent two F-16 seconds from above while Typhoons closed the net from the east, trying to overwhelm it with pure numbers and energy. Did the Gripen pilot panic? No, he reduced power. Think about that for a second. In a world where we're told more is always better, he reduced power because numbers mean nothing if you control the angles. He turned toward the approaching pair, and as they tried for a vertical split, the Gripen knifed between both attack paths, tightening its turn radius to a degree that defied the Falcon's flight computers. The canards bit into the airflow, the nose swung flat across the horizon, and the fight collapsed into a low-speed turning spiral, the absolute worst place for a heavy fighter to be. One Falcon overshot, the second bled speed too fast trying to keep up, and the Gripen just slid inside both circles. Another kill registered. The radio was static, then the confirmation. Gripen scoring again. At this point, the Eurofighters, the real beasts of the sky, closed in, and this was the true test. We're talking about high alpha performance designed to dominate the merge, and they forced the Gripen to defend. For the first time, it was survival mode, with fuel clocks ticking down and afterburners flashing in the Baltic sky. But the Swedish doctrine isn't about endurance. It's about short, lethal strikes. One Typhoon pilot got impatient, rolled too aggressively, and in that split second of an angle overshoot, the Gripen pilot exploited it. The nose snapped downrange, the gun sight crossed the target, and that was the third kill. When the exercise control finally called bingo fuel and told the Gripen to disengage, the scoreboard was a nightmare for the traditionalists. Gripen 3, NATO 1. And you have to ask yourself, how? How does the overrated plane do this? The debrief room was colder than the air outside because silence is heavy when reputations are shattered. On the screens, you could see the overlapping spirals, the knots of geometry where the heavy fighter's horsepower was useless against the Gripen's 0.3 second faster nose point response. An American instructor stood there, arms crossed, and said the words that should haunt every military planner. We outnumbered him, we outclimbed him, but we didn't outfight him. It was like trying to chase a knife with a sword. The Gripen wasn't winning with brute force. It was winning by entering the fight space nobody wanted to admit existed. Slow, tight, and unforgiving. This wasn't just a victory for Sweden, it was a validation of a doctrine that says a lightweight platform with superior situational awareness and turn rates can produce decisive outcomes against the heaviest airframes. Now, bring that home to Canada. When Sweden came to us and said, "We want to build the Gripen here with you for the Arctic," they weren't just selling a plane, they were offering us that same knife for our own backyard. They were offering a jet that was built to defend, yes, but one that attacks with a level of agility that makes the big guys look clumsy. You see, the myth of being overrated is what happens when you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, or in this case, judging a tactical surgical instrument by how much fuel it can carry. The Gripen was built to disrupt, to turn the sky into a maze of geometry where the enemy's strength becomes their weakness. As the Swedish pilot walked away from that exercise, he didn't need a headline. He had the logbook. He had the respect of every pilot who realized that if they ever saw that gray Delta canard shape in a real fight, they were in serious trouble. It's about the mindset, the refusal to fight the enemy's fight. And for those of us watching from the sidelines in Canada, it's a reminder that the loudest, most expensive option isn't always the one that keeps you safe in the circle. Are we listening to the data, or are we still listening to the brochures? Because in the Baltic, where the rubber meets the road, or rather, where the canards bite the air, the Gripen proved that the smallest blade is often the one that cuts the deepest. We have to look at this and ask, in our own vast north, do we want a sword that's too heavy to swing, or do we want the knife that never misses? This is the reality of modern air power that the world tends to forget, and it's a reality that was written in the skies by a jet they said would never survive a real fight. Can you imagine the shift in the room when those NATO pilots realized their superior tech was chasing shadows? This is just the beginning of the story, the technical breakdown of why the critics were wrong, but the real question is what this means for the future of a country like ours, standing on the edge of the world's most contested frontier. Now, let's pivot from the dogfight geometry of the Baltic to the frozen reality of our own backyard, the Canadian Arctic, because this is where the Swedish proposal to Canada transforms from a tactical what if into a strategic masterpiece. We've established that the Gripen can outturn, outpoint, and outmaneuver the heavyweights in a merge, but as any Canadian over the age of 40 knows, our defense isn't just about winning a 15-minute dogfight. It's about sustaining sovereignty over millions of square kilometers of ice, rock, and isolation. When Sweden stepped up to the plate and offered us the JS-39 Gripen, they weren't just selling us a piece of hardware, they were offering us a mirror of their own soul. You see, Sweden and Canada share a unique, brutal DNA. The cold, we both have to deal with runways that look more like skating rinks, logistics lines that stretch thousands of miles, and an adversary that is always watching from across the pole. The Swedish proposal wasn't just buy our jet, it was let's build a Canadian Gripen together. They offered to set up a production line right here on Canadian soil, ensuring that every nut, bolt, and line of source code was accessible to us. Can you imagine the power of that? For decades, we've been beholden to foreign powers for every software update, every spare part, every permission to modify our own equipment to suit our unique needs. But the Gripen doctrine is different. It's built on the idea of national resilience. They designed this jet to be maintained by a handful of conscripts, essentially, kids with a few months of training and a single mobile van on a snowy highway. Think about what that would mean for our forward operating locations in Inuvik, Rankin Inlet, or Goose Bay. Currently, moving a fleet of heavy fighters to the north is a logistical nightmare involving massive footprints and astronomical costs. But the Gripen, it thrives in the austere. It's the only fighter that looks at a 800-meter stretch of frozen road and says, yeah, I can work with that. This is where the overrated label truly falls apart. Is a jet overrated if it can fly 3 sorties in the time it takes a superior heavy fighter to get its engines warmed up and its computer systems synced? In a real-world Canadian scenario where we might need to scramble jets from remote strips to intercept a long-range bomber or a cruise missile threat, readiness is the only metric that matters. The original NATO data showed that the Gripen was winning because it flew like it wanted the enemy uncomfortable. And nothing makes an intruder more uncomfortable than a defender who is always there, always ready, and impossible to pin down. But let's talk about the industrial and technological benefits, the ITBs that we Canadians love to debate around the kitchen table. The Swedish offer was a multi-billion-dollar injection into our aerospace sector, promising to make Canada a global hub for Gripen support. We're talking about high-paying, high-skilled jobs for our children and grandchildren, keeping the talent we develop at schools like Waterloo or McGill right here at home. Why does this matter? Because sovereignty isn't just about having a jet with a maple leaf on the tail. It's about having the industrial base to keep that jet in the air when the world goes sideways. If a global conflict breaks out and the supply chains across the border dry up, where does that leave us? With the Gripen, the keys to the kingdom were part of the deal. We would have had sovereign control, a term that gets thrown around a lot in Ottawa but rarely lived out in practice. Now, I know what you're thinking, but what about the range? What about the single engine over the vast north? It's a fair question and one our pilots have asked for years. But look at the math. The Gripen E, the version offered to us, has a massive increase in internal fuel capacity and the ability to carry external tanks that rivals the endurance of those bigger, thirstier jets. And that single engine? It's the GE F414, the same powerhouse that drives the Super Hornet. It's a proven, reliable beast. When you combine that reliability with the Gripen's revolutionary data link, you realize that we don't need one giant expensive star of the show, we need a networked pack of wolves. The Gripen's ability to share information is its real cloaking device. One jet can have its radar on, while 3 others run completely silent, receiving the target data and positioning themselves for a pincer kill before the intruder even gets a RWR warning. This is the silent predator mode that redefined the NATO exercises. We aren't just buying a plane, we are buying an informationized battlefield. And for a country like Canada, which has to do more with less, being the smartest player on the ice is always better than being the biggest. This is the logic of a 50-year-old Canadian taxpayer who has seen defense projects balloon in cost while delivering less capability. The Gripen was the fiscally responsible warrior. It's a jet that respects the taxpayer's dollar while demanding the enemy's respect in the air. We're talking about an aircraft that has the lowest cost per flight hour of any modern fighter by a long shot. That means more training hours for our pilots. And as we saw in the Baltic 12, 52, jets don't fight, pilots fight. You can have the most expensive stealth platform in the world, but if your pilots are only flying 10 hours a month because the maintenance is too expensive, they are going to lose to the guy in the overrated jet who flies 30 hours and knows every inch of his flight envelope. The Swedish pilot in that exercise wasn't a superhero. He was a product of a system that prioritizes nose authority and situational awareness over raw horsepower. He understood that speed doesn't mean control. When he signed off his flight hours and left the base quietly, he wasn't looking for a headline because he knew the truth. The myth of the Gripen had been shattered in the only place that matters, the debrief room. Now, ask yourself, as we look at the shifting sands of global power, who is going to be our partner in the Arctic? Sweden is now a NATO ally, their interests are our interests, and their technology was forged in the same sub-zero temperatures that we call home. The Gripen isn't just a Swedish jet, it was a Canadian opportunity. It was a chance to move away from the big wing doctrine that has dominated our thinking since the Cold War and embrace a smart wing doctrine. It was an invitation to a club where we aren't just customers, but partners. In the final analysis of that NATO summary, the phrase aircraft performance discrepancies were mitigated by pilot doctrine stands out. That's a fancy way of saying the Gripen punched way above its weight class because it was designed to be a disruptor. In Canada, we pride ourselves on being the world's best peacekeepers, the world's best technicians, and the world's most resilient people. Doesn't it make sense to have a fighter jet that reflects that? A jet that doesn't need a massive, vulnerable airbase to operate? A jet that can hide in a forest or a snowy valley and pop up to defend our sovereignty with a 3-to-1 kill ratio? The Gripen isn't overrated, it's misunderstood by people who think size equals power. But those of us who have spent time in the North, who know what it's like when the wind howls and the equipment starts to fail, we know that simplicity, agility, and intelligence are the only things that survive. The Baltic exercise was a wake-up call for the world, a reminder that the smallest blade, when held at the right angle, is the deadliest. As we move forward, let's not forget the lesson of hidden valor. Let's not forget that in the merge of reality, where there are no cameras and no headlines, it's the jet that can turn the tightest circle and the pilot who has the best data who goes home. The Gripen earned its respect in the cold, gray skies of Europe, and it was ready to do the same in the high blue skies of the Canadian North. Whether we chose it or not, the Gripen changed the conversation forever. It proved that you don't need to be a heavyweight to be a champion. You just need to be the one who controls the geometry of the fight. So I'll leave you with this question. When the next overrated underdog comes along, are we going to look at the marketing brochure or are we going to look at the scoreboard? Because the scoreboard in the Baltic doesn't lie, and the ice in the Arctic doesn't forgive. We need to be ready, we need to be smart, and we need to be sovereign. That's the Gripen way. And that, my friends, is the Canadian way. If this deep dive into Arctic air power resonated with you, do us a solid, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our growing community of Canadian defense enthusiasts. We thrive on these strategic debates, and I want to hear your take. Do you think the sovereign control of building jets here in Canada outweighs the benefits of buying off the shelf? In our vast north, would you bank on the Gripen's agility or a heavyweight's raw power? Does the underdog success in the Baltic change how you view our current procurement? Drop your thoughts below. Let's get a real conversation going. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves and have a fantastic week. Canada. Cheers.